Humanity is innumerable, spread across the stars, with a military might befitting a galaxy-spanning empire like the Imperium. And yet, for all their numbers, there are a few individuals within humanity, or those who are ascended beyond it, who have become renowned even beyond their peers. In this series of vlogs, we shall take a look at some of those Adeptus Astartes of particular legend in this modern era, known collectively as the Champions of Humanity. Today, we arrive at the home of the last of the Legiones Astartes to be covered in this series. They're a small chapter even today, having seemingly never reached Codex-compliant numbers despite the millennia since Guilliman's original decree. Sadly, the tales of their champions are much less known than those of other chapters we have visited in this series, and so today we shall look at those tales that we do know in as much detail as we can. They are the sons of the Primarch Vulcan, led today by their chapter master, Tushan. They are the scions of Nocturne, the champions of the Salamanders. This is Tactica Imperialis, and welcome to Champions of Humanity, a 40k Stories mini-series. The first thing I think needs doing is catching a few people up on the history of the Salamanders, since I've never actually filled in the gaps of their history since they stopped being a legion. Due to their horrendous losses during the Horus Heresy, especially the infamous Istvan drop site massacre, the Salamanders were unable to form a full chapter at the time of the Codex Astartes being written by Robert Guilliman. As such, it seems that the Salamanders' Primarch Vulcan struck a deal with Guilliman, allowing the Salamanders to not sire a single successor chapter either during the second founding, or perhaps forever. Some might say that the Storm Giants and the Black Dragons of later generations are in fact descended from the Salamanders, but we have no concrete evidence linking the two to my knowledge, and the Sons of Vulkan have not officially acknowledged these supposed successors in any event. When the Codex was finally published, the Salamanders did conform to it as best they could, but their lack of numbers, recruitment methods, or whatever else meant that they could not reach the demanded 1,000 Astartes across 10 companies. Instead, the chapter chose to follow the tenets of its Primarch somewhat and divide into 7 slightly oversized companies. The Legion was originally divided into realms around the great cities of Nocturne, of which there were 7, so I'm guessing there's some symbolism there. And for some odd reason, the Salamanders have never, not even once that I know of, got themselves back to the 10 companies of strength and 1,000 Astartes as far as we can tell. In fact, it is believed that the 8th company, well, technically the 7th depending on how you classify the scouts, first was created in 980 M41, 10,000 years, and they never had the numbers to do this? I feel like tradition's playing a bigger role than I originally gave it credit, because I'm sorry, that just does not add up. I'm sorry, it doesn't. After the division of the Legiones Astartes, or the lack thereof within his own sons, Vulcan seemingly chose to just, well, naff off, and he was not seen for over a millennium. He didn't go completely quietly, we'll get to that later, but no one knew where he was once he'd gone. Admittedly, he also didn't just pull a Corax and disappear forever with basically no trace, as he next appeared in the War of the Beast in M32. This was on the Hive/Death world of Caldera, a world that was seemingly undefended against the Greenskins of the somewhat enigmatic warlord known as the Beast. The Primarch had sworn an oath to defend the planet after bringing it to a fiery compliance in the Great Crusade, and thus he stood alone against the Orcs. You might be wondering, therefore, how Vulcan managed to defend the planet, at least until word reached the Imperium. And the answer is simple. He's perpetual. He can't die, which combined with being a Primarch made him a real headache for the Orcs. Aside from Vulcan's return, then seeming final death fighting the Beast on Olenor, the Salamanders didn't seem to do much in the many battles against the Orcs that followed. They couldn't even get to Terra, too ensnared in their own campaigns to get back to the cradle of humanity in time. And following that, the history of the chapter goes dark for so many in that period, it's true, from M33 to M36 or so. All we know is that the Salamanders were the accidental instigators for the final rise to power of Asdrubale Vecht in the dark city of Commorragh sometime during M35. The Archon had been launching a daring series of raids into real space, perhaps too daring, and he capped it off by managing to capture a Salamander's strike cruiser that had been sent to investigate. This would have been somewhat fine, but it brought a librarian into the Dark City, and the fact that Vec deliberately left the door open to Comorra allowed the Imperium to launch a reprisal into the webway itself. Naturally, the Sons of Vulkan led this charge to retrieve their lost brothers, bringing a battle barge and elements of several companies into Comorra. And they won. Well, sort of, anyway. Their strike cruiser was saved, though several Astartes were unfortunately left behind and became all the rage in the arenas at the time. But it was the Dark City itself that saw the greatest upheaval as the Imperials withdrew. The rulers of the Dark City died both in battle and due to cleverly engineered assassination, leaving a massive power vacuum just waiting to be filled by Asdrubal Vect and his cabal of the Black Heart. There were some other battles and incidents, mainly involving a fair bit of fiery purging, because that's kind of the Salamander's secondary gimmick, but hopefully that at least gets a few people up to speed about the post-heresy history of the Sons of Vulkan. Now, we've done a little bit of history, now let's talk about their champions, like we said we would. Though Vulcan seemingly died for the final time against the beast, the Salamanders do not share the opinion that their Primarch is actually dead. This is reflected in the nature of the Salamanders' chapter master, or at least his title. The chapter vehemently believe that Vulcan lives and will return to lead them once more, and as such the chapter leadership merely rules in his stead, holding down the fort until the Primarch returns. As a result, the chapter leadership comes from within the first company as opposed to any groups above it, with the first captain taking the role of acting chapter master, known more officially as the Regent of Prometheus, Prometheus being the moon of the chapter homeworld Nocturne and home to the Salamander's Fortress Monastery, in case you weren't aware. The Regent heads the chapter council, 18 Astartes who lead and guide the Salamanders as best they can, and he and the first company, known as the Fire Drakes after the Terminator elite of the 18th Legion, are the only ones permanently resident on the moon, along with trainees. The history of the role, though, is not well documented, but succession appears to be election following the death of the previous regent, and we do not know of almost anyone to be the regent throughout the millennia. However, we do know the current chapter master, an individual by the name of Tushan. Though obviously a Nocturne native, details of Tushan's life are sadly unknown until the death of the chapter master before him in 938 M41. We don't know when he was recruited, nor do we have a combat or deployment record or anything of the sort to let us know how long he'd been serving, where he'd been, all those sorts of things. All we really know is the simple fact of his ascension to the role of regent after Huron Blackheart put a violent end to the previous one, who sadly we don't even have a name for. The transition of power seemed to be pretty smooth, but within only a few short years, the new regent's command was to face one of its sternest tests. In 941 M41, the Orcs and a prophet of the War, Gazkul Mag Uruk Thraka, launched their first invasion of the linchpin hive world of Armageddon. Whilst the Armageddon Steel Legion and especially Commissar Yarrick distinguished themselves attending to defend their home, it took the intervention of the Adeptus Astartes to turn the tide of the war. The aged Lord Commander Dante and his Blood Angels chapter took the majority of the plaudits in the Space Marine counterattack, as it was they who broke the back of the Orcs with their trademark assaults, whilst the Ultramarines took responsibility for the defence of the hives that were yet to fall. The presumed younger Tushan did little of these two things, instead focusing on the smaller problem as far as the Imperium was concerned, that being the citizens of Armageddon. The Salamanders defended refugee columns from opportunistic raiders sent by Gazkul, escorted the vital water columns supplying the besieged hives, and generally gave their lives to keep the planet's people going. It is widely acknowledged that it was the efforts of Tushan and his warriors that saved so many human lives, and the most famous of these came near to Hive Tempestora. The Salamanders were massively outnumbered by a force of speed freaks racing toward the water purification plant for the river Stygius, and were forced to hold a key bridge across said river to ensure the hive did not suffer a slow death by dehydration after the plant's destruction. We do not know how many of Tushan's lot started or ended the battle, but they held out for 3 whole days. and though High Temper Story did not remain in Imperial hands throughout what remained of the war, its people were evacuated and likely watched over whilst doing so by the Salamanders, as opposed to killed by a simple lack of water or by those speed freaks. The Salamanders did so much for the people of Armageddon, in fact, that they became perhaps the most trusted allies of said people, and Tushan was recognised for this. When the day was done and the war was won, Dante honoured the regent of Prometheus in front of the entire Blood Angels chapter, which is quite an honour, I suspect. Following Armageddon, Tushan is known to have seen action a decade or so later in 955 M41. In a battle known as the Killeneth Rebellion, location unknown though presumed to be a world called, well, Killeneth, the regent and his troops faced off against a force of rebels, though not seemingly chaos-aligned ones. Details are sparse, but it was believed for a moment toward the end that Tushan had died, caught in a direct attack from a Hellhound flame tank. However, someone didn't seem to get the memo about salamanders and fire, especially since the chapter master had a fire drake scale cloak on, and so Tushan not only strode unharmed, but delivered a fitting reprisal. Using his Thunderhammer Stormbreaker, potentially a weapon he made himself as all salamanders are renowned blacksmiths, Tushan utterly annihilated the offending Hellhound in a single blow, effectively putting the rebellion down with it. We don't then see him in records again until he returned to the world that made him the somewhat legend that he is, Armageddon. Most, if not all, of the Salamanders chapter were amongst the first to arrive for Ghazghkul's second attempt to conquer the planet, and once the Orcs broke the Navy cordon and made planetfall, the Sons of Vulkan got back to business. They often worked for the good of the citizenry, including a butting of heads with the Black Templars in Hive Hell's Reach, but much of their combat took them out into the wastes in an attempt to destroy the repurposed asteroids-turned landing craft and teleporter arrays known as rocks. Nearly a dozen were destroyed by the efforts of the Salamanders, cleansing them from the inside out, though a large portion of the chapter remained in the region near the Hemlock River when not on these missions. Exactly where Tushan was for much of the conflict is unknown, but there is talk, if not confirmed reports, of a falling out between the regent and a captain of the somewhat infamous Marines Malevolent. The story goes that an under-attack refugee camp was shelled by the Malevolent as they couldn't afford / didn't have time to aid the humans there. Tushan was so unimpressed that it supposedly ended in a fight, which given the reputed strength of Tushan would not have ended well for that particular captain. Although two companies of the Salamanders did remain on Armageddon even after Ghazghkul left due to the unofficial ceasefire caused by the weather, being heavily involved in stopping the ritual to summon Angron after the coming of the Cicatrix Maledictum, we do not believe that Tushan was part of the crew that stuck around. Where he has been and fought during the Age of the Dark Imperium is unclear, especially now that the Primaris Marines are a thing and not filling that 10 company thing is really kind of not a problem anymore. But I'm sure we'll find out all the details eventually. Oh, and he also has a personal Thunderhawk with custom fanged maws as a paint job called the Primordian. Kind of a throwaway fact, but pretty cool, huh? During the Horus Heresy, before travelling to Istvan V, Vulcan met with the Salamanders' Forge Master Tekel to discuss the fate of the various items and artefacts that Primarch had forged throughout the Great Crusade. Vulcan had come to the conclusion that all of said artefacts needed to be destroyed, a response to the fall of the traitor Primarchs to prevent the weapons being abused by others as Chaos had turned Horus and co. However, Tekel argued against the complete annihilation of the artefacts, and so Vulcan decided that 7 of the thousands of items chosen by the Forge Master could be preserved as a way to maintain the Primarch's legacy. Vulcan then took a further 4 with him to Istvan V, whilst the rest were to be destroyed before the Primarch's return, which, as we now know, only came much later. Unfortunately, due to the disaster at Istvan and then battles with the Sons of Horus and Iron Hands attempting to take the Forge ship, destroying them, the remaining artefacts were almost entirely lost. One was recovered from Istvan by first captain of the time Artilus Numian, but the rest were not seen for millennia. One of these 10, the hammer Dawnbringer, forged for Horus but wielded by Vulcan, mysteriously vanished and was replaced by one called Doomtremor by the time of the War of the Beast. But the Salamanders had bent their resources toward hunting down the remaining 9, perhaps since they originally disappeared. To do this, they adopted the title given by Vulcan to Tekel, that of Forge Father, who gives up their other roles and even their original name to hunt down the artifacts. Should note, the Forge Father is not the Master of the Forge. We'll get to them later. It is unknown exactly when the role of Forge Father was established, but it was not until M41 that the Salamanders met with any success, when the Forge ship Chalice of Fire, the vessel aboard which the other artifacts were destroyed and also an artifact itself, was found adrift, having been damaged in the aforementioned battles. The vessel became the primary forge for the entire chapter, and mounted aboard it was a second artifact, this laser-turned orbital defense weapon known as the Eye of Vulcan, but the vault containing the remaining 5 being preserved was empty, meaning there were 7, if you include the 2 lost at Istvan besides Stormbringer, to still be found. However, there has been substantial progress made by the most recent holder of the rank of Forge Father, Vulcan Hestan. Not his original name, you take the name of Vulcan on becoming the Forge Father. Having shone as a scout and a smith, Hestan had been captain of the 4th Company before being elevated by the Chapter Council. In doing so, Hestan left his company behind to join said council in his new role. He could now call upon any of the Salamanders to aid in his hunt as opposed to those he once led, as the chapter is always eager to hunt down its history and its Primarch's legacy. Quite when he came to the role is unclear, but he is almost certainly older than his chapter master, having been confirmed in a hunt-based battle in 722 M41 and serving as captain for a century or more even before becoming Forge Father. As far as artifacts go, Hestan has managed to outdo all of his predecessors massively, seemingly recovering 3 of the artifacts during his tenure and now wielding them personally. The one we can date is from the just mentioned battle in 722 M41, a war against Eldari Corsair Prince Ayath Bloodweaver. At an unknown time, Bloodweaver came into possession of the weapon known as the Gauntlet of the Forge, one of the artifacts that Vulcan had taken with him to Istvan V. This heavy flamer is a quick igniting and high-powered thing that, according to legend, nothing could withstand, and after learning of its location, Hestan led a force of Salamanders to hunt it down. Which they did, though exactly where is unknown, with Hestan's forces victorious and retrieving the gauntlet. We do not know when the other 2 artifacts carried by Hestan were recovered by the Forge Father. In fact, I wouldn't want to say with absolute certainty that he did recover them, merely that he just uses them. The first of these is another weapon, this one for melee, the Spear of Vulcan. This spear is somehow superheated, seemingly hot enough to slice through even heat-resistant ceramides of Astarte's armour, and while supposedly it requires a Primarch's hand to unlock its full potential and must be shielded in mortal hands, it is still incredibly potent used by Hestan either in melee or when thrown. The final relic is Kiser's Mantle, a cloak made from the scales of a salamander or other drake-like creature, presumably named Kiser or possibly Shovala. Sources seem to conflict. This is another of the relics taken to Istvan V by Vulcan, though who was in possession of it before it was reclaimed we unfortunately do not know. The mantle is said to be near impenetrable by both the conventional weapons and by heat or energy based weapons, making it a versatile armour piece if Hestan can get it between himself and whatever's coming his way. As for the other 4 artifacts, almost nothing is known either by us or by the Salamanders. Details supposedly are encrypted within a document known as the Tome of Fire, which therefore guides the Forge Father in his quest, but aside from their names we basically have nothing to go on besides some minor footnotes. They are known as the Engine of Woes, which seems to be a doomsday weapon or something Vulcan just never got round to using, the Song of Entropy, a staff that launched a supposedly unstoppable beam, the Insidian Chariot, presumably armour or a vehicle, and the Unbound Flame. No idea on this one, but the phrase is written on the casket of Vulcan, so it's probably pretty important. The chapter, led in its hunt by Hestan and whoever succeeds him as Forge Father, will obviously attempt to gather these 4 artifacts, but it seems as though there is a second motive behind simply inheriting the last relics of their Primarch. It is prophesied or believed that if all 9 artifacts are gathered, Vulcan will somehow return to the Salamanders. Quite how this works, I honestly have no idea, but such is the way that prophecies often go. Maybe it's more of a metaphor or some sort of map or something? Either way, the Salamanders seem to believe in it pretty strongly, and the power of faith is a pretty impressive thing in this galaxy, just ask the Ecclesiarchy. Oh, but make sure never to tell the chapter about one of the last artifacts Vulcan made if you don't mind, seemingly guided by the Emperor in a way that he couldn't even remember. The Talisman of the 7 Hammers. This thing, looking something like a compass, was designed to be nothing short of a dead man's switch for the Golden Throne. In essence, if the throne ever completely failed, then the talisman would destroy Terra and deny it to those invading it. In the case of the time, it was Horus and the traitors, just as the Emperor had supposedly always planned. I have to wonder whether anyone save the Emperor and Vulcan knew about this thing. Since we've become aware of the fact that the Golden Throne is failing and requires shady deals with the Drukhari to try and keep it going, maybe the Mechanicus know that they're racing against the clock to save the cradle of humanity. Well, technically it's 2 clocks, what with the whole keeping the human webway project from spilling demons all over over Terra, but I doubt the Gala know much about that one. They're not that sort of people. Unfortunately, the other Salamander champion tales are a little bit too short. So in a manner similar to other chapter logs in the past, I wish to do a quick little miscellaneous section if I can, looking at the other current members of the command structure. The first is the Master of the Forge or Chief Tech Marine, an individual known as Argos. In case anyone is still unsure, the Forge Father has nothing to do with the Tech Marines. He's a captain. He's got nothing to do with Mechanicus training. He's not a Tech Marine. Argos is an individual whose history involves gene stealers. A lot of gene stealers. Back in his days as a scout, he and a future chaplain were on a cleanse and purge mission against the gene stealer brood on the planet of Ulcinar. Unfortunately, his squad mate got himself into all sorts of bother, and intervening to try and protect him from the gene stealer they were hunting at the time caused massive acid burns on Argos's face. And later, after he'd become a tech marine and joined up with the second company, something similar would happen during the cleansing of the planet Imgal, supposedly the original world, or moons, colonised by gene stealers in the days before the coming of the Tyranids. The Salamanders launched a massive cleansing purge against Imgal's moons sometime after the Tyranids arrived, though sadly this battle is undated, and though it was a roaring success, it was not a total annihilation as far as we know. And for Argos, it was some level of deja vu, as he suffered even more grievous face wounds against the Great Devourer's forerunners. Whether by acid or claw is unknown, but it was serious, so serious in fact, that half of his face had to be rebuilt with bionics. We don't know how long he spent as the second company's tech marine, but at some point he rose to the highest position a Mars-trained individual can ever reach, that of Master of the Forge, Chief Tech Marine and member of the Pantheon Council. The other divisions or subgroups within the chapter also get a single seat alongside the Tech Marines, the Librarius, the Chaplaincy and the Apothecarian respectively. Unfortunately, the leader of the Reclusium is a total mystery as far as I've been able to discern, but we do know a little of the other two, the Chief Apothecary and the Chief Librarian. The former is an individual known as Harath Shen, who probably spends much of his time overseeing the legendarily slow recruitment of the Salamanders. He was doing this, at least at first, the one and only time we can place him in history, the beginning of the Badab War. Shen was asked to join the campaign against the future Huron Blackheart by 2nd Company's Captain Pelasmir San, who was seemingly one of the cooler heads amongst the various loyalist commanders in the war, which is no surprise really, given we had the Red Scorpions, we had the Minotaurs, and then we had the Carcharodons in that conflict. They aren't the coolest of heads. How much fighting the Chief Apothecary actually did in the war is unclear, though we do know he was involved in a couple of Salamander-led operations, but he was perhaps somewhat pivotal in the redemption of one of the secessionist chapters. Shen was aboard the battle barge Pyre of Glory when the Astral Claws launched a raid to try and capture Salamander gene seed that was on the ship for some reason. However, Though the Salamanders didn't have the strength to hold out and actually surrendered, they wouldn't have to bother giving up their cargo. The Executioners, an Imperial Fist successor fulfilling a blood debt to the Astral Claws, took affront at the Claws' actions, and the forces of the Executioners who were part of the raid turned on and wiped out their supposed allies for daring to steal the Gene Seed and massacre the surrendering Salamanders. Captain Miyasan was unsurprisingly grateful to the Executioners despite them being on opposite sides, and a year or so later, the captain managed to persuade the Imperium to grant a measure of clemency to the chapter and let them withdraw from the Badab War. How much more Chief Apothecary Shen got up to, we do not know, nor do we have any records of his actions once the Badab War came to an end, unfortunately. As for the Librarius, their leader is an individual simply known as Velkona. Unfortunately, we seem to know even less about this guy than we do about the Chief Apothecary, which is definitely disappointing. In fact, his role on the Pantheon Council and on the battlefield is entirely unknown, which is really frustrating, as it would be interesting to just see the viewpoint on Psychers relative to the Legion, relative to the Codex and other chapters, all of that fun stuff. However, we do know one thing. He has a role to play in guiding an individual seemingly referenced in the Tome of Fire that we mentioned with Vulcan Hestan earlier. This individual was Harzon Dakia, a veteran sergeant of the 3rd Company who developed latent psychic potential much later in his life and career than most inductees to the Astartes. As for the prophecy around him, according to whoever translated the Tome of Fire to Tushan, Dakia could either save or doom the Salamanders. I mean, I know prophecies have a bit of a flair for the dramatic, but that's a bit much. Despite the seeming severity of this prophecy, it was not Velkona that Dakia was entrusted to for training. Instead, it was one of the other librarians known as Piriel who was given this perhaps arduous task. However, Velkona still kept an eye on things and intervened to keep the fire in check and prevent any harm being done when Dakia's power accidentally unleashed a blast that may have killed Piriel. Having rechecked exactly what the prophecy was saying, Velkona decided at this point to put a failsafe in place lest it transpire that Dakia ended up Destroyer as opposed to Saviour. Simply put, if the power got out of control again, Dakia was going down. Since this all happened pre-Great Rift, it remains to be seen exactly what the situation is with that lot. We haven't heard tell of massive psychic explosions within Mount Deathfire, the largest volcano of the homeworld of Nocturne, and the first training place for all librarians, so either the training's ongoing, Dakia has been disposed of, or we're just missing some information about how things have progressed since then. I'm not sure which. So end the tales of the champions of the Salamanders. Perhaps of all the heroes we have explored through this series of logs on the great modern Astartes, it is the Sons of Vulkan who can likely stake the greatest claim to the title of Champion of Humanity. Though they have their own quest to follow and tasks to pursue, they have proven to be tireless defenders of people when the Imperium as a whole either couldn't or wouldn't bother to try. They have proven to be true ambassadors for their Primarch and his ways, and should Vulcan return either through being a perpetual or by the recovery of his artifacts, I have almost no doubt that the 18th Primarch would be incredibly proud of his Legion turned chapter. Now, we must get back on our travels once again. There's been some serious disturbances that seem to have disrupted the transmission of previous logs, but hopefully that'll clear soon after this one. Actually, I don't think I have any destination in mind this time. Most of the groups I wish to talk about next time are of no fixed abode, I would suspect, and the rest are using beasts of war that would put the Salamanders to shame. They're not huge factions, these groups, but they're an interesting insight into the society of a race and how it has evolved both before and since its collapse. For now, I hope you've enjoyed this latest installment of Champions of Humanity, a 40k Stories miniseries. Thank you for watching Tactica Imperialis, and I'll see you all again. Goodbye.